Hey designers, welcome back to the studio. Today we're going to start working with our graphite drawings, but we're going to work with digital versions of it. Or in other words, we're going to begin the kind of transformation between sketchbook and computer and then back again. This is a process that we'll use regularly throughout the semester, so I want you to get sort of in the habit of sort of quickly navigating back and forth between hand-rendered things and digitally rendered things. One of the easiest way, I think, to jump back and forth would be use your smartphone and take a quick photograph of it. Now this is going to have its own limitations, but we'll kind of talk through that here in a second. So when you're digitizing your image, try to make sure that as you're taking the photograph, right, it fills the frame. We want to get as high of a quality of a picture as we can, and you may have to orient your phone, right, so that it's in the correct orientation compared to your drawing. When I take a nice full frame shot, I want to be careful to hold my camera really steady. And also, a couple of things about sort of the conditions for your setup. It's really nice to have natural light coming in, so if you can set yourself up near a window, that would be really awesome. If you can't and you're working in a basement space or an interior space, make sure you have a nice bright lighted space. I also want you to make sure that you're not photographing down at an angle or shooting from the side. Make sure that your phone is at the same level as your drawing, or I should say, make sure that they're parallel to each other. There are a lot of different ways that we can transfer these files from the computer, from your smartphone to the computer. If you happen to be using Apple devices, using AirDrop is a really fast way to do it. I'll just click this little send icon down here in the corner, click AirDrop, and then find wherever your computer is on the other side. If you don't have AirDrop enabled, or if you have your Bluetooth disabled, you may not be able to send it. Alright, so on the computer, you'll notice that in each one of these tutorials, I'm recording from a Mac OS platform. PC guys and Chromebook guys, this is going to be a slightly different kind of feel. Occasionally we'll use different keyboard shortcuts, and when I talk about specific things, it'll come from a slightly different angle. That's alright, you guys are pretty capable, I think, and you'll be able to translate between platforms. If you can't get your, if you're working with something other than a Mac OS software and you can't do an AirDrop, I recommend doing either a direct cable connection, emailing to yourself, messaging to yourself, some way, get these files to your computer. When I try to do a file transfer from my smartphone, you'll notice almost immediately, right, that it pops up here in the upper right hand corner. It'll end up in my downloads folder. What I'm going to encourage you guys to do for this class is to try to kind of stay pretty well organized. I recommend right-clicking your desktop and creating a folder called 2D Design. The folder on your desktop, I'm obviously not going to have direct access to, not unless you share something with me, but it'll give you a place to start storing things, like for example, the files that you just made, or the photographs that you just took in the studio. Within your 2D Design folder, make a new folder inside of there called Cut Paper. Our Cut Paper project is our first unit, and this is where I recommend storing these files. We're going to start producing a certain amount of digital files kind of hiding on your computer, and if they're just sort of scattered around your desktop or if they're hiding somewhere else in your computer, it's going to get pretty complicated. So if you notice up on my desktop, I try to keep things reasonably well organized. I'm teaching a 3D design class and a 2D design class this semester, so I know that everything I produce for those two classes is hiding in there. One of the kind of skills we'll learn this semester, aside from a sketchbook organizational technique, is a digital organization technique, which streamlines your digital workflow and will just allow you to work more efficiently in the classroom. So in this tutorial, I'm assuming that you were able to download and install Adobe Photoshop and Illustrator. If you don't have access to that software, either your machine can't run it because it's an application and not a web-based or a browser-based software, I recommend checking out this blog post. I'll share you guys the link in class on the blog. Make use of 8 best free browser-based Adobe Illustrator alternatives. A couple that we have used before in class for guys would be Graphite and Vector, but there's a whole bunch of these things, and for the most part, they capture the basic functionality of Illustrator that we are going to use. They're not as deep of a program, they're not going to take you quite as far, but they will fairly intuitively allow you to follow along with our in-class demonstrations. This tutorial isn't going to cover Graphite or Vector. We're going to cover everything from an Illustrator perspective, but I'll do my best to kind of help walk you through this software as well. So to get started here, let's actually dip into Adobe Photoshop. We're going to go to one of the photographs that you made here in the studio. I'm going to click and drag that file onto the Photoshop icon. If you don't have the kind of click and drag functionality, you could always just open up Photoshop and do a file open. So whether you do a file open or you drag and drop it in, this is more or less what you will see when you first jump into Photoshop. Over here on the left, you should see sort of a skinny palette of tools. Up here along the top, you see kind of a couple of different options, what we'll call our control panel or options bar. And then over here on the right, you may see some palettes, and your palettes may be collapsed, but I'm going to work my tutorial here with them open. If you don't have a layers palette open, go to Window and click Layers. Now layers is such a common part of how such a common sort of piece of the functionality of Photoshop that they give it a shortcut. Keyboard shortcut F7 will always snap you to this. Now I've got a background layer in this photograph so far, not much else. You see that in the photograph that I took, I included a little bit of extra stuff, and so we'll talk about in Photoshop 2 techniques to kind of help clean up the image. Before we do anything else though, let's take a look at what we actually have. And I'm going to use the keyboard shortcut Command plus to zoom in really close. Now, in this drawing now, which has been turned into a photograph, I think it's really useful to see sort of what these drawings are made up of once they've been digitized. The rastered sort of approach to digitizing media reduces what used to be like a really nice hard line on the page, a graphite line on the page, reduces it to pixel structures. And when you reduce something to a rastered pixel structure, it's reliant on very physical things. I know pixels seem really digital, but take a look at that edge of my line. It goes from white paper, which is really not looking very white, it's full of a lot of kind of speckly grays and things, to black line, which isn't really black, it's made up of a lot of sort of speckly dark grays, but it makes that transition over the course of about 2 or 3 or 4 pixels, right? There's a small gradation that happens at that line. For that reason, and this is kind of a simplistic illustration, rastered digital images are always limited. They're limited by physical things like the lighting that you used in your studio, the lens that you used, the type of camera you used, whether you were photographing at a straight angle or slightly skewed. Each one of those factors will affect what you ended up with your digital file. So let's kind of do a couple of edits here to see if we can't clean that up. At the bottom of your layers palette, the little half black, half white circle, click that open, and down here toward the bottom, I want you to select threshold. And when you're working with a threshold adjustment layer, you're able to manipulate how extreme that layer, or how extreme that edit is sort of allowed to take place. Now I'm going to set it somewhere right in the middle and zoom back in on my drawing. Now you notice that when I threshold this design, I've essentially duotoned it. Duotone, 2 tones, black and white. No more am I kind of transitioning from a light gray to a dark gray, but I'm just pure black and pure white pixel structures. This is sort of the way a Xerox machine thinks. If you know, you're kind of familiar with that kind of quick copy, it usually reduces fairly high quality, complex photographic imagery down to very simple black and white. It's a digital image in the truest sense in that it's highly simplified, where if we go back to that, if I turn off this layer and go back to my pencil drawing, this is a highly complicated sort of set of grays, not pure black, pure white. Most cameras, most computer screens are going to show you a sort of a gray scale of roughly 256 different levels of gray. A duotoned image is pure black, pure white. Depending on the lighting that you used, you may or may not be able to get a full resolution version of your image. You see this kind of creeping black cloud that starts to slide in on my design? That's a result of uneven or poor lighting. If I try to get all the detail out of my drawing, I end up sort of getting a lot of clouds. If I try to blow the clouds away completely, I end up losing detail. This is another truth about the strangeness of the sort of limited nature of rastered images. We're always going to be limited by all these really physical things, the quality of lighting, etc. So do your best to kind of lay a threshold in that captures the most amount of detail with the least amount of this kind of creeping black cloud. We'll do one more edit in here. So keyboard shortcut C, or if you come over to your toolbar, this sort of sideways tipped diamond, that tool is going to allow you to sort of eliminate anything that shouldn't be there. Like for example, the spiral binding of your sketchbook, or maybe you accidentally got in some of your cutting board or the desk. Let's just kind of pull in that crop a little bit so that your design, your rastered design, is just your drawing. Double click inside of that crop or click the little check mark that's up on top, and we've got a finished thresholded design. do a File, Save As, and we're going to export this file as a JPEG. I recommend putting it right into the same folder, your 2D design folder on your desktop, in the Cut folder assignment, and I want you to change the format from a Photoshop document to a JPEG. I want you guys to get into the habit of understanding that when your smartphone takes the picture, it'll export a JPEG. When we start working in Photoshop, it will default towards saving a Photoshop document or a lossless file or a RAW file. Let's reduce it back or compress it back down to a JPEG, put it right back into that folder, and as long as it slightly changes the name, you won't end up replacing the original. Click Save. So now if we go back to the folder where you are, you have your original photographic image, and you've got the thresholded copy in there as well. So let's go all the way back to the program Illustrator now. I'm going to open up Illustrator, and on first flush it will look very much like your Photoshop document. Photoshop and Illustrator are designed by the same company, and they actually feel very similar. So within the program of Illustrator, I'm going to click Create New. And since we will oftentimes be exporting to a printer with our projects, we're going to design for print. And the paper dimensions that we load into our printers are not measured in points, but in inches. So double check and make sure that your document dimensions are 8.5 by 11 inches, which is that standard size printer paper that you do all of your other schoolwork on. And click Create. Now within Illustrator, you'll notice that there are a couple of very similar structures. Over here on the right hand side, I have a bunch of palettes that are already opened. Yours may be collapsed. Mine are open. Across the top, we have a very similar kind of options bar, and over here on the left, we have a toolbar. If I use the keyboard shortcut Command-, you'll notice that there are some differences though between the way Illustrator and Photoshop appear. This document, this little square right smack dab in the middle of Illustrator, is your document window, or what Illustrator refers to as the artboard. If I clicked print, for example, the only thing that would show up in the printer file would be what's inside this document. But Illustrator gives me a huge work area all the way around the outside of this document, and I want you to think of that as sort of your desk or your workspace. This is where you'll be pulling in multiple photographs, maybe playing with text, working with colors. And for the sake of this project, what I would like you to do is bring in the original photograph into Illustrator. I'm back in my cut paper folder that's on the desktop, and I'll just click and drag that file right into Illustrator. Once you've got your photograph kind of dragged and dropped into Illustrator, you'll notice that you have some basic kind of functionality here where if I hover over the corner, I can do things like rotate the image, or if I want to reduce the size of it, I can sort of hover over the corner. Keep in mind that as you're reducing the size of your image, you may really distort it. So to avoid that distortion, hold Shift. Holding Shift prevents you from distorting the image, and you can reduce it down to more or less the same size as the document window. Command plus or Command minus gives you the same kind of zoom in, zoom out functionality. Now, at first flush, this is going to look very similar to your Photoshop file in that I still have a rastered image, and I'm working with sort of all these kind of problematic pixel structures. But Illustrator is fundamentally different in that it does not, it's not limited by the pixel structures. In fact, it uses a different kind of design system called vector. So we're going to perform a similar edit to our photograph within Illustrator that we did in Photoshop. To do this, let's make a copy of our image. You can make a copy in a couple different ways. What I like to do to make copies in Illustrator is to hold the Option key on a Mac, click and drag. See how I got a little double black and white arrow that makes a quick copy? PC guys, that would be your Alt key, and also you're going to have to make sure that you're using your selection tool. The keyboard shortcut for your selection tool is V. And then on this right side image, we're going to perform an image trace. Select that image, go to Window, scroll all the way down through all these different options, and find your image trace option. So depending on the speed of your computer, depending on the quality of your photographs, an image trace could take a really long time. Let me explain what's happening here. As I click on this image, yep, it may proceed slowly, I'm going to generate a preview over here on the left side, and I'm converting this image from a rastered pixel-based photograph, which still looks basically the same as what we had in Photoshop, but it's no longer limited by these little blocky pixels. Instead, what I've done is I've eliminated every single one of those pixels and converted this to vector. If that doesn't really make sense to you, let me actually expand this thresholded image to show you what I mean by vector. I'll go to Object, Expand, click OK, and now I'm going to use a different selection tool, keyboard shortcut A, or my Direct Select tool, and zoom in a little bit. When I use my Direct Select tool, I can see that I've converted my entire design to not pixels, but a design that's made up of nodes, or what Illustrator calls vector points or anchor points. This is the way that a lot of computer-based design programs function and think about design. What it frees this design up to do is that it's no longer limited in scale according to the original camera that was used to photograph it. It's also not limited by the kind of dreaded resolution problem. Now, what I can also do was once I get a hold of this design, once it has become vector, is I can edit out and pull out specific things. Let me show you what I mean. First of all, I'm going to have to right-click, ungroup this design, because once I vector trace something, it likes to kind of come in as a big grouped object. And not only has it traced the sort of black lines, which I really want to get a hold of, but it has traced out the white areas as well. So I should be able to kind of click and drag out the white areas, which seems a little bit strange to do at first, but if I take my white areas and I convert them to a black shape, or I give them a black outline, you can really easily see what's going on here. So let me grab all those and maybe give them a black fill. Okay, so now I can also kind of click and drag over specific parts of the image that I would like to get rid of, like for example these large black sections that I had to crop out in Photoshop. And then now that I can get a hold of this design, looks like I missed a little something over here on the left. I'll just kind of select that and delete it. Now I'll select this whole design, do a keyboard shortcut Command G, or if you want to right click, group, I can make quick copies of my design. I can do rotations or reflections. Or I can work with different colors. In this case, I want to keep the sort of black lines of my design, but give it a background color. A background color in Illustrator could be quickly generated by adding a shape, say in this case an ellipse or a circle. I'll put a circle behind my design. Right now I drew a white circle on top, but I'm going to right click, arrange, and send that circle to the back. Essentially I've layered it now. Double click my color options and give it a color to sort of use as a background. In this case, somehow my design got limited to pure black and white. I'll go to Window, Color, keyboard shortcut for that is F6. Click this little pancake stack up here in the corner and switch my color space to RGB. And from here, I could also do things like manipulate the color of my design itself. So one of the great tools about the computer is that once I'm in this software, I've taken something that used to be limited by the pixels that I made with the camera. Something like the white pixels, gray pixels, the black and whiteness of the studio project, to being able to click and select out specific parts of my design, manipulate it, and even add or manipulate colors to that design. What we'll do with this project right off the bat is you'll be turning in your Photoshop file, the JPEG that we exported, that's pure black, pure white duotone, but I'll also have you turn in a colorized version or a part of your design that you've modified using Adobe Illustrator or another vector-based program to bring color. I'll see you in the studio, guys.